And before I begin on the 14th of December, we want to know more about the summit and also the agenda of the summit itself. Now we have in our studio the European Union Ambassador to ASEAN, His Excellency Igor Driesmans. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here with us. It is a great pleasure. We're counting days until the EU-ASEAN summit. It is, as Kai mentioned before, it is the 45th.
24th.
It's 24th, sorry, excuse me.
It's the 45th anniversary.
45th anniversary.
24th
so it is,
symposium.
yeah, it is such a milestone.
Yeah.
So of course, again, there is so many that is happening within this year alone. What would be the agenda for the EU-ASEAN summit for this year?
Well, it's actually almost a full EU-ASEAN week because we'll start the week with a event on higher education, talking to some of our young students from both regions.
Okay.
That's on Monday. On Tuesday, we'll have a major business summit where ASEAN leaders get to know some of the biggest CEOs that we have in Europe. But we also have a separate youth summit because we think it's important that the youth is able to convey their messages to the leaders as well. And then the actual summit starts on the 14th. It's going to be an almost full day event whereby the 27 heads of state and government of the EU, plus our 2 institutional presidents, meet with all of the ASEAN leaders. So quite a week.
It is indeed.
So the interesting is, you know, that there has been, towards the end of the year, after the G20, there's been international meetings after international meetings.
Yeah.
We would love to know what the main purpose of this particular meeting is. This is the 24th symposium. And is there any pillars or main focal points that you will be focusing on in dialogues this year?
Sure. Well, I'd name 3 if I can. The first one is the green transition. Big issue for all of us. It's a big issue within the EU. Try to become carbon neutral by 2050, but also in ASEAN. We know it's not easy. There's lots of challenges to decarbonize the economy, but we believe it's possible with the necessary investment. So we're going to talk about that, how to get there, how to go towards renewable energy, where can we find those investments, and so forth. Second topic will be connectivity. You mentioned it in your introduction. Just a few weeks back, we signed a landmark agreement, the EU-ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, basically locking in the 37 countries, 27 Europeans and 10 from ASEAN, in a first ever region-to-region free trade on the airspace agreement. So that's quite a big deal. It's one example, but we need to push further this kind of sustainable connectivity between both regions. And lastly, we need to talk about security. Obviously, we face major challenges in Europe. We see the war of aggression of Russia on Ukraine continuing. Also Southeast Asia is not without challenges. We see the situation every day, the atrocities in Myanmar happening. So we'll have a conversation about that and what we can do to tackle those challenges.
Right, and you were saying before of these 3 pillars, and those are the main purposes, especially for the summit for this year itself, sustainability, connectivity, securities, and whatnot. What are the expectations from the EU society, especially after these meetings? And we know, and what we've seen from G20 summits, we do have these bilateral meetings between leaders and whatnot. And those are the agendas, those are the meetings, talking points. But what is the expectation after that, going forward?
Right. I think over and beyond the specific topics that I have mentioned, you know, we live in very volatile geopolitical times. There is big power competition. There is violation of international law happening every day, violation of territorial integrity happening every day. Free trade is under attack. And what we think is that European Union and ASEAN together, we can be an anchor for stability, an anchor for security, for multilateralism, for free and fair trade, for a rules-based international order. Because both of us, EU and ASEAN, we live somehow by rules, international rules that govern the way states are supposed to relate to each other. So we do hope that by working together, we can ease some of those tensions which we see around the world. I think that should be the longer term objective that we both share over and beyond, making sure that we indeed have a green transition, that we tackle some of the security challenges, that we connect our societies better, and so on.
You know, one aspect that has always been an interest of mine when these dialogues happen, right? Is it because, as you mentioned before, EU is a community, ASEAN is also a community, which, as mentioned before, share a lot of similar principles, right? And in terms of dialogue, is it a dialogue to help each other or learn from each other to come up with, you know, different solutions that could help each party? And how do these conversations usually, you know, take place and flow during dialogues like these?
Right. So maybe I should start by saying that the EU and ASEAN are very different in the way that we work,
Yes.
the way our decision-making works. ASEAN is very intergovernmental, works by consensus. The EU is not. But of course, we have something in common, that is that we try to look for agreements within our own regional organization. So we're used to these kind of conversations. So what you'll see on the 14th when doors are closed is that we hope the leaders can have an honest conversation on some of the topics that I mentioned, and there will be enough time for that. But of course, in the margins, there will be a lot of bilateral meetings that will, I'm sure, add a lot of interesting conversations to the overall debate between the two blocs.
And more in depth to tackle, especially during
That's
the
right.
matters itself. We know that G20 summit, the presidency was hosted in Indonesia, and we of course learned that the ASEAN summit with next year, the presidency is also the chairmanship is held by Indonesia or President Joko Widodo. What is the EU view on this? It seems that this 2 years, alone, Indonesia is playing a vital role in this.
That's right. I think I must admit that we've all been very impressed by the way that Indonesia has been handling the G20, not just in terms of organization and protocol and logistics, but also the political steer that it's been given to the G20. And at the G20 summit in particular, we saw your president being able to gather all of these nations in very difficult times and come up with a joint statement. And I think Indonesia deserves a lot of praise for what it managed to do in Bali at the summit. And of course, we hope to build on that momentum going forward, as Indonesia will be the chair of ASEAN throughout most of next year.
Right, and the talk is now not only going to be what is happening inwards in our nation, but also what is happening. You were mentioning about Myanmar and the struggle for them to have that democracy right now. There are so many things in the plate right now as the chair of the ASEAN itself.
That's right, and expectations, I will not hide you, expectations are high for Indonesia, because of course Indonesia within the region, it's 1/3 of the population, it's 1/3 of the economy. Has a very good foreign policy system, so very effective. So, of course, the expectations also in dealing with the Myanmar crisis are high. So we hope that Indonesia will play a big role in trying to resolve matters. We know how difficult it is, but I think Indonesia can count on the EU for any support needed in returning that country to democracy.
Well, speaking of support, we know that the EU has quite the presence here in ASEAN, especially when it comes to collaboration, collaborative efforts in relation to improving the economy and international law and the effectiveness of multilateralism here in the region. Could you please just elaborate what kind of, because I am aware of a lot of different EU projects that support these pillars. Could you please elaborate on how the EU is helping ASEAN really improving its economy and perhaps maturing in sense of governance and everything else?
Sure. Well, bilaterally, we have now 2 free trade agreements in place, one with Singapore and one with Vietnam. And we hope that Indonesia will be the 3rd ASEAN country with whom we conclude a free trade agreement. It's hugely beneficial for the trade on both sides, and hopefully thereafter other ASEAN countries. But we also help ASEAN countries to come together and create the ASEAN economic integration or ASEAN community building, as ASEAN prefers to say it. I'll give you one example. We supported the launch of the ASEAN customs transit system, which basically allows a truck to go from one country in ASEAN to the next and then to the next without having to do the necessary paperwork, but just fully digitalized.
Right.
And that, of course, is just one example of how we also use some of the experience which we gained with European integration for the benefit of ASEAN economies.
Yeah, so influencing a lot of the European Union culture to
Yeah.
the ASEAN countries itself. Now, Ambassador, we're going to come back again to the summit itself, and then of course to the assessment that has happened in G20 summit itself that impacts on the G20. The declaration to EU-ASEAN and EU-Indonesia relation and cooperation. Do you think this will propel again to the summit of the EU-ASEAN summit that is held on the 14th December?
I think so. I mean, if the question is, will Ukraine figure and the language in the statement will be a discussion, of course, it will be. I think for us, it's important that both sides can reaffirm that what's happening in Ukraine is not okay, that we should condemn it, that there's certain principles which are enshrined in the UN Charter, which are territorial integrity, which are, the right of every sovereign country to govern itself, that should not be violated. Even if you're a big neighbor and you have nuclear arms, it doesn't give you the right to invade another country. So we will have that conversation for sure, and we would definitely want to see some of those principles, which are shared by ASEAN, reflected in the joint statement.
Yeah, indeed, we're hoping for a fruitful summit itself, and hopefully whatever that's going to be discussed and also the assessments and declaration can be upheld by all the leaders that will be joining on the summit itself. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here with us on the 3 Hours News Show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, we're certainly looking forward to another joint statement
Yes.
by EU and ASEAN by the end of next week, and all the best and safe travels back to Europe.
Yes, and hopefully you can come back again here and share with us,
Yes,
please.
My
please
pleasure.
share it with us. We're going for another break.
And of course, when we return, we're going to have many more right here on 3 Hours News Show, so don't go anywhere.